last year, as a kind of spiritual exercise, I rewatched all Orson Welles films in chronological order. It was, and there's a book out called Orson Welles at Work, which is a French book. It's been translated into English, and there's no film criticism in it. It's all nuts and bolts about how much he spent, what the crew size was, how many shooting days he had, but film by film. So I was watching the films and reading this book at the same time. And it's interesting to watch the kind of lessons he learned about filmmaking through his career, and then how they're all kind of deployed in that film. You know, Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, he had, and even the Stranger and Macbeth. Mm-hmm. You know, he had Hollywood crews. He was predisposed to the kind of the long take. There's very little fast cutting, and then when he gets to Othello, you know, he's got to constantly improvise because he only has, you know, like the famous story in Othello is they all showed up in Morocco. They were supposed to start shooting the movie, and the costumes hadn't arrived, and so he immediately changed the scene of what's his name? Anyway, that guy Iago has killed. He sets it in a steam bath, so the characters are only wearing towels with, you know, smoke everywhere. And as I was watching this, you know, the whole last section, Welles just plants this little thing. He has this little lines. It's foggy in Paris, but, and then he goes in, and the rest of the movie is just shot against a fog background, which he probably shot, you know, in his backyard, or you know, in his garage or something. But it's just that little line, and he has a photograph of the airport in Paris, and then he dissolves into the fog. But he was constantly, you know, cheating shots, where he would one actor wouldn't be available, so he'd shoot around them, and so that when that actor became available, they'd only do the close-ups. In the 50s, Welles did a series called Around the World with Orson Welles, which is, I think, his first television documentaries. And it's got a very similar style to F for Fake, where Welles, you know, or somebody else shoots interviews, and then Welles would shoot his part later, and then he would take this interview and then incorporate himself in. So he's using these kind of Othello techniques in a television documentary. One of the things, I was editing my first, I had edited a couple of documentaries before I saw this movie, and when I saw this movie, I was thinking a lot about editing and how I wanted to edit, and I was trying to learn as many lessons as I could from other filmmakers. And this film just knocked me out and completely changed the way I think about film editing. There's a little bit of, you can see kind of the Eisenstein influence in his cutting rhythms and things like that, but you know, in documentaries, you're almost always, a lot of documentaries are based on interviews. And you shoot these interviews, and they're really dialogues. You're asking a question, and then you get into the cutting room, and you take the dialogue and you turn it into a monologue. And what Welles did was he would take the dialogue, which was somebody else's dialogue, turn it into a monologue, and then put it into dialogue with other monologues that had been transformed from dialogues. And then he could put himself in it, and just the control. That's another thing I realized as I was watching this, was the amount of control that an editor can exert in the cutting room. So I'm working on this Einstein on the Beach documentary, and there was a documentary that was made of Einstein on the Beach in the early 80s, and it turns out they shot hundreds of rolls of film and they didn't use any of it. They only used performance and interviews. So all this film material was stored in a storage locker in New Jersey, so I got the stuff out. I learned to edit on a steam deck. So I thought these were, you know, motor skills that would never be employed again. So now I'm going through all, you know, reel after reel of this material, and again it made me think of this movie. There's something about film, actual material film, that's not been digitized. For one thing, that it lasts a long time. You know, I can go into a storage locker, pull out a reel of film, and thread it up onto a Steenbeck, and it works exactly the same way as it would have in 1984. It's as if no time has passed. And I was imagining going into a storage locker and seeing, 10,000, G-Tech G-Ray drives that are 30 years old, and they're all just going to be like rusted hunks of metal that nobody can do anything with. So there's something about film that can be repurposed. Even within this piece, they're faking little things, but they're also using old newspaper clippings. There's like a really nice handmade quality to a lot of it. Like their little question marks are written on in Sharpies or glued on with glue stick, and he's also got like the little gag he did in the airport, or this like
there's a collage quality to
it's all this extra stuff that he had. He did a little skit, and he could plug it in. It becomes part of a larger, kind of collage composition. So, and that also, I was thinking about too. There's a lot of these, different techniques he uses really effectively, like the freeze frame. When he did this movie, in order to do a freeze frame like that, you'd have to send your material to the optical house. So you couldn't just, like today on a computer, just do a freeze frame or a dissolve. All those dissolves, all those things were opticals that had to be done later. So you kind of rough them in with grease pencil or a leader or something. And I think maybe that's part of what he was doing in terms of shooting the material off the Steenbeck. It's also a way of creating low-budget opticals. You can do a freeze frame by shooting the Steenbeck frozen. You don't have to sit there and send it to an optical house every time you want to do a freeze frame. I mean, part of what is interesting about magic tricks is that we know they're fake, and it's part of what's interesting about theater. We know it's fake, but we suspend that disbelief. But we do it in the service of a kind of critical thinking. Theoretically, if you're, Wells, or if you're, Bertolt Brecht or something like that. But Wells was a serious amateur magician, and at the beginning he says, have you heard of Robert Houdin? Which is a reference to Robert Houdin, who was a famous French magician who ran a theater with Georges Méliès, who started as a magician. So there's a whole current of cinema that is coming out of stage magic, and film itself is based on a kind of stage magic. The kind of tricks that happen, optical illusions are taking advantage of kind of gaps in our hard wiring of perception. But and Houdini named himself after Robert Houdin, so that's where Houdini's name is coming from. But Houdini's biographer was a guy named Maxwell Grant, who
also wrote The Shadow.
Who wrote The Shadow, which Wells played on the radio. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?
The Shadow.
The Shadow knows. So that's Wells. But so I remember reading a biography of Houdini written by Maxwell Grant, and I was also reading those Shadow pulps because I found a bookstore that had. But what was interesting reading those is that Maxwell Grant would use these types of tricks, like misdirection. He would plant a clue, but not so much that you would get hit in the face with it. He would just plant it there so that you could feel like, oh, I'm clever enough to notice this, and it was a trick to get you off the track of what the real, it was a little bit of misdirection, and that's part of the art of stage magic or mentalism. Or they're little tricks that take advantage of the way our mind really does work.